Yeah, and it was kind of like, as you were sharing that, I could just picture like using this verse, convincing people that they can't trust their heart. But if you can't trust your heart, like what can you trust? Oh, I guess I can trust the pastor. So I could trust what, so it's another like little
100%.
Little nudge towards authoritarian.
towards control. Yeah.
Hello, and welcome to the Ancient Jesus Future Faith podcast. I am one of your hosts, Tana Sheaver, and I am joining me today is Sarah Minardi.
Hello.
And Don Sheaver.
Hey.
And today we are going to talk about emotions. So I wanted to start off by asking, I don't know which one of you wants to hop in first, but what have you been taught about emotions in the church or by your pastors, by other people in the church?
I think that the emphasis on the heart being deceitful, not being able to trust emotion. I had a Facebook memory pop up a little while ago from, I didn't really look to see how many years ago, but it was something like, forget happiness, give me joy. So this idea that like joy is better than happiness in some way. Yeah. So those are, what about you, Don?
I think growing up, emotions were kind of almost viewed as a competitor to God and prayer, right? Like that if you let emotions take you, that in some way that was manipulating the relationship with God, or it was an unclear view of what God wanted. And so that you were, in some way, you were kind of not only to check your brain at the door, but check your emotions at the door too, when it came to prayer, expression of faith. And I think I may have mentioned before on this podcast, I grew up in a church that was like the frozen chosen, right? Like if you took too deep of a breath, you were like too charismatic for the church. So I think that probably also had a bit to do with it, right? That emotions are particularly in more frozen communities. I don't know a different way to say it. Emotions tend to be more associated with charismatic. And so it was just very much like leave your emotions at home, that they don't really have a place in your faith unless you're rejoicing at something God has done for you.
I didn't even think about that from the Pentecostal thing. The frozen chosen. That always makes me laugh because I never heard that until you said it. But it resonates with me because as I've said before, I grew up Catholic and then I went to a sort of more fundamentalist church that was not Pentecostal. And so, yeah, it was very like, I don't know, just, you were just there. You did. I don't know how to express it. It's not like, I don't want to say it was completely emotionless, but it was reserved.
There were unspoken rules of appropriate emotion for the moment.
Yeah.
Right? Like, and it was very obvious to everyone if you expressed the inappropriate emotion in the wrong moment.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like emotions are not meant to be used in decision making, but it's even as you were saying that, I know that there's like traditions out there that play on emotions a lot in how they preach or how they do worship. So that there's some of that happening, which is somewhat opposite. And then there was the whole seeker sensitive thing where those churches were coming up and there were actually spoken rules that said, don't raise your hands because we want to make the seeker comfortable.
Right. Yes.
Right. I forgot that aspect of it.
Yeah.
That was like a seeker sensitive thing.
Yeah, I have a feeling this is a predominantly Protestant, maybe Catholic as well, but predominantly Protestant, white suburban, non-charismatic issue.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, and maybe not when it comes to prayer and stuff, or how you come to the place of knowing what you need when you're seeking God, but I think just in general of how you carry yourself within a church structure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Sarah.
No, I was just going to say, I think that might be true for like in terms of worship and services and like expressing joy and things like that. But I think when we talk about like anger and sadness and grief, that there might be the pot might be bigger of more denominations having the same problem with how to deal with those
Oh, yeah.
in relationships and things like that.
That makes sense.
So.
Yeah, that's one. I 100% agree. And we asked some folks on social about this, you know, and asked their experience. And a few people responded that the idea was you can't trust your emotions, which I think is really interesting because I remember being taught that growing up, like your emotions are not trustworthy.
Yeah.
And I thought it was funny. The one person commented, I find it amusing that a faith riddled with absurdities often tries to discredit the emotional part of human existence to stick with what? Logic, facts, science. Mm-hmm. And that's really interesting to me. The you can't trust your emotions, but faith it feels inherently emotional. Mm-hmm. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, I think we're made in the image of God, and I think God is emotional, and I think we're designed to feel these different emotions, and that if we ignore or discredit our emotions completely, that we're missing a whole piece of ourselves. You know, we've got the physical, the social, the emotional, all these different pieces of ourselves that I believe reflect God's image in us. So when emotions are downplayed or not trusted or just put to the side, we're missing something.
Yeah. One of the things I have often wondered about this sort of moratorium on emotions and this idea, specifically the idea that you can't trust emotions, is how that's been weaponized against women in particular in the church. Because I feel like as a society as a whole, we have this weird thing where we're like, women are emotional.
Yeah.
And we specify specific emotions with that, right? So we're like sadness, grief. A lot of people would call it hysteria, you know, things like that. So women cry and women do this, women do that. They're irrational. Whereas somehow anger is not an emotion in this like discussion sometimes, you know? So like we see angry male politicians all the time. And then there's people who will be like, a woman can't be president. She's too emotional. And I'm like, have you seen some of the dudes who are president?
Yeah, right.
Like, you know, and so there's this part of me that wonders if a lot of this, like, oh, you can't trust emotions message in the church is just another way to oppress women.
Right. And it's in control.
Yeah.
Because we want to control we want to tell you what makes you happy.
Yes.
You coming to church makes you happy. You coming to Bible study makes you happy.
Don't forget you serving your husband.
Yes.
Makes you happy.
Yeah, we want to tell you the things that make you happy. So if you're feeling happiness in other areas, then be careful. You're missing a mark.
Yeah. Interesting choice of words.
Yeah.
So what would you say? Because, you know, I've had this conversation, Tana, you and I've had this conversation quite a bit. But I'm curious if there's some other emotions that maybe I haven't heard the male descriptor of that emotion.
Yeah.
And the female descriptor of that emotion, such as a male is passionate, but a female is hysterical.
Right. Yeah.
And it's the same emotion, or a man is determined and
Right.
a woman is nagging.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. So can you think of other things like that? That
There's got to be, I'm sure there's a list somewhere.
maybe our listeners can help us out
Yeah.
too.
Well, I think like a man being angry would be a woman overreacting.
Oh, that's
So righteous anger versus
Yeah.
overreaction.
yeah. I think that's definitely the overreacting kind of hits hard, right?
Yeah.
Like because that doesn't only tell you. I mean, it just feels like that communicates so much more than just, hey, simmer down a little bit, right?
The thing I hate is that for me personally, I don't know if other women struggle with this, but so I have, as you both know, I have an autonomic instability. And for people who don't know what that means, it basically means my autonomic nervous system, which controls like almost all the basic bodily functions, just can get easily thrown out of whack. And one of the side effects of that is when I am stressed, I can easily get into sort of a panic attack kind of place, and it immediately shows up as tears. And so a lot of times if I'm in a stressful situation, say even at a job, and there's a confrontation or whatever, the tears start going. And I hate that because I know that in a lot of people's minds that immediately discounts anything I'm going to say. Yeah. Any emotions I'm feeling are just, wow, that's an overreaction. Like, oh, we must have touched a nerve there or whatever. Whereas if that wasn't how it showed up and I got angry instead, it feels like, or if I got angry and was male, it feels like that would be more acceptable.
Do you think that maybe the underlying lie behind this, particularly since, we're in a male-dominated culture, whether we like it or not, and do you think it's that there's a sense that men believe, falsely, that they're in control of the emotion, so therefore they're able to have it, but women are not in control? Because you were talking about kind of like that you can't control the tears.
Yeah. And
for some reason that hit me, and I'm like, I wonder if men as a whole, or just the way men have been socialized to think, and even think about women, is that, you can go 95 miles per hour down the highway because you know how to control the car.
Yeah.
Right. But other people shouldn't go down the highway at that speed because they're not as good at controlling this out of control vehicle. And so I don't know. It struck me. I don't know that there's anything to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that it just made me think I've never thought of emotions this way, but it's another beautiful piece of how we're made differently. So yours is a medical condition, but I also have one friend I think of in particular that is pretty quick to cry when she's sharing things. And I would say I am very slow to ever get to the point of crying.
Interesting.
Challenge accepted.
But I think it just reminds me of this idea of especially in marriage, my husband and I talk about learning each other and studying each other, and that it is a beautiful gift to learn your friends and in your relationships, how do different people handle emotions and or not even handle, but how do they express their emotions? Because for one person, tears might be pretty common. So not that you dismiss it, not to say oh, Tana's crying again, forget it, but you can take all that information in. And I'm mostly talking about it not being a medical thing, but then
Sure.
when you see somebody who never cries crying, and then you take that with a different,
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't take it with a grain of salt. So it's another beautiful expression of individuality. And I wanted to share, kind of came to mind when you were talking about something previously, and I credit this to, I follow Joe Luehmann on Instagram. I hope I'm saying the name correctly. But
Sorry, Joe, if she's mispronounced Joe.
yeah.
Oh, I know who you're talking about.
Yeah.
It's a woman.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And so, but this idea that I saw in one of the posts about how there's these unspoken acceptable ways to or limits upon expressing emotions in public settings. And they're different for women, but they're also different for minorities.
Yeah.
That there's certain ways that minorities are expected to behave in places because if they go too far down a wrong emotion, then it's not acceptable. So we're talking from our experience, right? We have men and women here. We can't really speak for being minorities, but I just want to throw that out there that that idea that, and maybe someday we can bring somebody on to speak to that, but that there's also trying to be aware of people who are different from us, and if we're uncomfortable when they express the same level emotions that people the same as us, it wouldn't bother us as much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's something I've heard a lot, that anger from Black people in particular is taken differently. And I've heard some different Black scholars talk about that, about how it's like it's somehow it's less acceptable.
Yeah.
And that's not fair.
No.
Don, do you have any thoughts?
When we talk about emotion, but we speak about it or manage it sans the person it's attached to,
Mm-hmm.
we can't even begin to talk about healthy approaches.
Yeah.
Right. And I think one of the problems that we face in a church setting uniquely, because that's what we're talking about, but I believe this probably happens in the office, it happens in public squares, whatever, right? That there are hidden rules, or sometimes maybe not so hidden, of a homogenizing of the emotions.
Yeah.
And in so doing, we really dehumanize the people that they're attached to.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
and I think that's a lot of what you were saying, Sarah. It made me think about, Tana and I in our relationship. I'm way more the crier when it comes to everyday life, right? Like there is not a day that goes by probably that either Tana or my son walks in a room and I'm not at least weepy-eyed watching something. But if Tana and I are in a dispute or we're frustrated, we're arguing with each other, I shut my emotions off, which is really unhealthy. And that comes from an abusive childhood, right? Which also impacts emotions. And so it's interesting because even in the settings, the shifting of the settings, the amount of emotion that one shows is greatly changed. And
Yeah.
when we homogenize these things and say, this is the standard, then we cause either people to swallow those emotions, we cause people to pretend like they're not having them, and really we're creating time bombs, right? In a lot of ways. So yeah, you just had me thinking about the fact that just in my own life, there's things that I think people who know me in one setting would be like, wow, I'm so surprised you behave this way in this setting, speaking about the way I respond emotionally. But it's because that's how my body reacts, right? My body feels safer in one moment to be able to cry, and then protective to not want to cry in other settings.
Yeah.
Or quick to anger in a certain setting as a way of survival that isn't necessary in another one, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I think the time bomb thing, is real, that like if we aren't able to work through our emotions, it can be like a time bomb, or it can be a leak. Like they'll leak out in other ways because they're not being addressed.
I kind of want to go back to what you were saying, Don, about how you wonder if like men perceive anger as something they control.
well, it's
Yeah.
because we perceive we control everything. And so that just fits in.
Yeah.
And I wasn't really even saying that tongue in cheek, because we're raised to imagine that we are in control of not only our destiny, but many others' destinies along with us.
Yeah. And I do wonder about the control piece. Like I'm very curious about that, because I wonder how much of it is control versus the feeling, or both, that it's righteous, like that your anger is always justified. And I definitely feel like, white men's anger is weaponized in interesting ways. And one of the best examples I can think of this is the confirmation hearing for Brett Kavanaugh back in
my drinking buddy.
20 I like beer. 2018, 2019, I can't remember which year it was. And, Christine Blasey Ford, I think that was her name, testified. And immediately, so there was this, break from the hearing, and all of the pundits on every channel, even Fox News, were like,
she
sobered.
testified him about assault, right?
Right. She testified against him. Sorry. Yeah. In case people don't know. Yeah. She testified that he sexually assaulted her when they were in college. And everybody afterwards was like, wow. Like it was like really sobering. They were just like, what a credible witness. It's hard to see how anybody's going to recover from that. Like it was this moment. And and I was messaging with different female friends during this, and I remember thinking, oh my gosh, someone's listening. It was like, huh. And then Kavanaugh testified, and he yelled and cried, actually. But mostly he was angry, and and it was like so many people after that were just like, oh, she was lying. And that was just such a fascinating little case study for me, because she was very measured. She didn't even get like incredibly emotional. She was, because she's also, I forget what kind of scientist she is, but she was like, well, I remember because this is what happens in the hippocampus. Like, you know what I mean? And she was very like clinical about some of it. And she was very measured. And so it wasn't even like you could be like, well, this woman got up and was super emotional and like discount her. But the guy came up and was angry. And then people were like, well, he's so angry. Guess he was telling the truth. Like, it's just.
Yeah.
So
and the crying
weird.
part is interesting to me too, because I feel like it's less acceptable for men to cry, but it's almost like they can keep it in their back pocket, because if they get into trouble, they can pull it out. And then.
Well, do you guys remember last night we did a live stream on the 17th of November with David Gushy, and we were talking about how, like, in certain situations where a male pastor falls from grace.
Oh, right.
Yes.
And he made the comment, and I said, the pastor gets up, apologizes, and everyone's like, oh, wow, or asks for forgiveness, and he goes, and if he can muster up a tear, is what Gushy said. And I mean, that's it right there, right? That, wow.
Yeah, and it's so celebrated when that's like the baseline of what should happen in that situation. Like that's like the minimum of what should happen is
an
apology, right?
Yeah.
Well, I would say the minimum that should happen is apology to the victim.
Yeah.
And then.
Yeah, that's the other thing is a lot of these cases, the pastors are apologizing to the congregation.
Yeah, you're right. So I'm saying it in the wrong way, but but it's like this. You did. People act like they did so much, but it's
you
so
did
little,
your job,
and there's so much. Yeah, there's so much more that should and need to be done.
Yeah, I showed up and did the bare minimum. Where's my applause?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that we have thoroughly convinced our audience that we have some emotional work to do.
Yeah.
So
you mean we, like the three of us?
Well, I don't want to speak for the two of you, but me has some work to do. So what is the right response to emotions, or what is the better response to emotions than in the church?
Well, I thought that it might be interesting to share this list with everybody. Oh. So the book I'm holding is called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. I don't know how to work the camera, but it's by Pete Scazzaro, who was actually the pastor at the church I attended in Queens. Him and his wife were mentors to my husband and I, and he has a list early on in his book of the top 10 symptoms of emotionally unhealthy spirituality.
Ooh.
Oh.
So, do you want me to read the whole list, or should I read one and then we'll talk about it? What do you think?
A whole list?
Okay, I'll read the whole list and then we'll maybe go back.
Yeah.
Okay, so 1 is using God to run from God. 2, ignoring the emotions of anger, sadness, and fear. 3, dying to the wrong things. 4, denying the past's impact on the present. 5, dividing our lives into secular and sacred compartments. 6, doing for God instead of being with God. 7, spiritualizing away conflict. 8, covering over brokenness, weakness, and failure. 9, living without limits. And 10, judging other people's spiritual journey. So I realized just reading those that some of those might not make sense just on the the surface. So if we start with the first one, using God to run from God, some of the things he talks about when he develops that is when I do God's work to satisfy me, not God. When I do things in his name that he never asked me to do. I'm just reading directly from the book. When I demonstrate Christian behaviors so significant people will think well of me.
Say that last one again.
When I demonstrate Christian behaviors, in quotes, so significant people will think well of me. When I focus on certain theological points, for example, everything should be done in a fitting and orderly way, 1 Corinthians 14:40, that are more about my own fears and unresolved issues than concern for God's truth. When I exaggerate my accomplishments for God to subtly compete with others. When I pronounce the Lord told me I should do this, when the truth is I think the Lord told me to do this. When I use scripture to justify sinful parts of my family, culture, and nation instead of evaluating them under his lordship.
I know someone I could send that book to think about.
When I hide behind God talk, deflecting any spotlight on my inner cracks and becoming defensive about my failures. When I apply biblical truths selectively when it suits my purposes, but avoid situations that would require me to make significant life changes. So that's just the first one, using God to run from God, because I feel like that needed a little development.
Yeah, I feel like there was one you said, and I don't remember if it was in the description of the first one or if it was one of the other.
Yeah.
But it was basically the like, oh, God told me to do this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I pronounce the Lord told me I should do this, when the truth is I think the Lord told me to do this.
And I honestly think that's one of the spots where emotions can be dangerous, because you can feel like I think there are people who feel like God has told them to be oppressive in some way to other people, and to judge them and to call out the sin of blah, 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 because they have their own
fear. Damn that blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, you know, that's the big sin right there. I think it's listed in Corinthians. And like that one feels like that's a super, super dangerous one. And that is always one that causes me confusion.
Yeah.
Of like, how do you know when God is actually telling you to do something?
We should all just carry around like a sheep's wool. And if someone says, God told me, we'd be like, all right, well, we're going to put this out tonight. And see if it has dew on it in the morning. So get back to me in the morning.
And it's supposed to snow tonight. So
yeah. Well, I think this one really relates to the sixth one, doing for God instead of being with God too, that like we can busy ourselves with God work instead of building a relationship with God. Yeah.
So Tana, you said something about the idea that, you know, this is where emotions can be bad. I think that there's probably just some emotions. Well, maybe I'm going to take that back before I even finish my sentence. I was going to say, I think there's some emotions that are just inherently bad. Like I was thinking about jealousy and stuff, but then I think about the way that jealousy is used in the Hebrew Bible, about God being jealous about Israel basically having an affair with other gods. But I think maybe after I kind of process this a little bit more, it's that there's some that on the surface tend to lend itself to unhealthy behavior, but is not always unhealthy behavior. And then there's some on the surface that lend itself to healthy behavior, but is not always healthy behavior. And I think like anything else in modern Western Christendom, if we can't fit the concept on a bumper sticker, we've lost, we no longer are interested.
Yeah.
Or at least that's what the pulpit has continued to tell us, right? That because I found that most people actually want a much more deeper, thorough understanding of faith and how to wrestle with things. But we've kind of been given this impression, we've been spoon-fed this, that, oh, well, if your faith isn't simple, you're overcomplicating it. And really, I would argue, faith is super complicated.
Yeah.
And when we try to oversimplify a super complicated thing, it's going to fall short, right?
Yeah.
So anyhow.
Yeah, so do you think some emotions are inherently bad, or do you think emotions are morally neutral?
I think emotions are morally neutral. However, I would say that I think people react either ourselves when that emotion rises, or outside of us, others watching that emotion rise in us, make assumptions about it, right? So whether it's jealousy, envy, these are some things, and, maybe we can debate. I always get confused. Am I conflating emotion with something else when I talk about like envy and stuff like that? So yeah, I think, thank you for asking the question. I do think that emotions are morally neutral. I think that certain emotions tend to rear up in unhealthy situations, and therefore we have attached them or associated with them unhealth.
Yeah. And they can lead to unhealthy or harmful behaviors.
Right.
So we have to think about what is the emotion, how are we expressing the emotion, and how is it impacting those in our world?
I think that's the key, is how it's expressed and what actions come as a result of it. And one of my favorite things that I learned from a therapist was that emotions are okay. Don't, because I was beating myself up for feeling certain things. And he was like, it's okay that you feel that. And you trying to push that feeling down is more detrimental to you.
Right.
And so he encouraged me to sit with the emotions instead of trying to be like, well, I don't want to feel jealous or angry or whatever right now. Just sit with it and allow it to be, and then move on from there.
Right.
Yeah.
Which reminds me of the saying that like emotions are information.
Yes.
Because what is making you angry? Yeah. And I've also heard it talked about that anger is often a surface emotion. There's almost always or always maybe that an emotion underneath it, like sadness or fear. But that when we can sit with these feelings and admit them, and then ask the question, like, what has led me to this? Because we do need to get angry about some things.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think that there's like an overemphasis of like praise for controlling emotions. That like, I feel like personally, like somehow I got that message that it's just better to be in control of your emotions, which might be why I'm slow to cry, or it reminds me too of like how we treat children, that when they're crying, we just want them to stop crying as quickly as possible. And we want them to be in control of their emotions because it makes us uncomfortable.
Right.
So constantly shutting them down or just trying to distract them or quick fix. And I remember reading something about like just encouraging parents to let their children cry when they're crying and not to interrupt the cry. And so if your child's upset, just let them finish the cry. That's much more healthy physiologically.
Yeah.
To just let them get through the end of it. And
Like not lock them into a room until they're done crying.
no, like hold them.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Just hold them and create a space for them to feel that entire cry until they're at the point where, because, oh my goodness, this just reminds me that like, I remember growing up feeling like if I start crying, I'm never going to stop. It felt so much pain inside that if I let myself start crying, I'm never gonna. It literally, like I literally believed I would never ever stop. So I would just not let myself start crying because there was so much hurt in my life that like it was just. So I didn't have that safe space to just cry, and yeah. So then I just end up thinking that it just felt like so much that there was never going to be an end. So maybe that's part of it. That's important to experience that, like, yes, you cry, but there is an end to it. You know, you do get to the end of expressing that feeling, and something happens on the other side of it, and it's not terrible.
You know, what you were saying about the, oh, I can't remember what you just said in what you just said that reminded me back, but it took me back to what you said earlier about it being about control.
Yeah.
Oh, that we've discounted certain emotions and we think certain emotions are bad. And I think we see that in greater society as a whole with this emphasis on civil discourse, right?
Yeah.
Where there's like acceptable ways to express anger, or, well, anger is not one of the acceptable ways to express dissatisfaction with oppression or, you know, bad laws or, you know, whatever. And it is this strange thing where like we're like, here's these acceptable avenues, and you have to present this logical, calm argument for your thing. But then we
did
cut
you file
off
the
those
right
avenues.
Paper, or did you smash a window?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But then we cut off a lot of those avenues to people. And then when people express anger and dissatisfaction in other ways, we're like, well, you didn't do it the acceptable way. And, you know, so yeah, I think a lot of it really does go back to control.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So what do we do with this verse that the heart is deceitful above all things?
Well, I think we have to understand in context, first of all, right?
Yeah.
They're about ready to go into exile, or they're already in exile in Jeremiah. And
is that where the verse is?
Jeremiah 17:9.
yeah. And so in that passage, this is more about a people group who may decide not to fight against what's happening. And because it's just going to be easier to relent, right? So like this has nothing to do with Sarah Minardi, your emotions, like your heart's deceptive. No, and also the heart is not emotions in the Hebrew Bible. It's the center of everything that makes you human. It's reasoning, it's thought, it's everything. So we would say it's our mind, right? In the way that maybe it's evolved, right? We would say, you know, your mind is deceitful. We wouldn't call it heart is deceitful, right? And so yeah, this passage is so abusive to so many people, and it's so sad because it's really easy to determine what it means when you read the book of Jeremiah and realizes that this prophet is talking to the people in the midst of a very big event that is happening.
Yeah.
And the people are wavering. If this was done as a halftime speech, people would be like, that's the greatest speech ever. But since we're able to pluck out one line out of the midst of this story, we then made it about individuals and made it about emotions. And instead, this is really the prophet being like, you know, I can see you're wavering as a people. And remember that's that which is causing you to waver, your heart that is causing you to waver. It's lying to you. You need to fight against this. Right? That's beautiful. Like, right? Like that's
more hopeful. Like, have strength, be hopeful, not like your heart is gonna trick you.
Right. Yeah. Your heart is just waiting to pounce on you with some bad advice.
Yeah. And it was kind of like, as you were sharing that, I could just picture like using this verse, convincing people that they can't trust their heart. But if you can't trust your heart, like what can you trust? Oh, I guess I can trust the pastor. So I can trust so it's another like little
100%.
Little nudge towards authoritarian.
Towards control, yeah. I found this. I'm sorry, did you have more to say about that?
I was just going to say pretty much everything in Western, and when I say everything, it's bombastic. I get it. So it's too big of a blanket, but almost everything. There you go. That's better. That is spoken from a modern Western white male-dominated pulpit, intended or not, leads to maintaining the power in that one spot.
Yeah.
Right? It's how we've been taught to think about faith. It's how we've been taught to interpret the Bible. It's how we've been taught to present the scriptures, a hermeneutic that points to that, all of that. So whether or not the pastor is a product of the system or is furthering the system with intention. Most of the pulpits in America that are, again, white Protestant pulpits are fighting every Sunday to maintain the power over the congregation that's in their midst. Instead of shepherding them, they are lording over them.
Yeah, and I think that it connects with like why worship teams like are trying to create an emotional experience and why the pressure to be in church every Sunday and that like this is where happiness is, this is what you're supposed to be doing. And it reminded me, as you were saying, of I think this was a Sunday at our church probably a couple years ago by now, and our friend was there and he was like, oh, my wife's not here because she's on a bike ride. And I just remember you celebrating that you were so happy that she was like out having a bike ride. And like, I think that that's such a beautiful thing because she's out finding happiness. And to me, when we explore and spend time with things that make us happy, it's also a time to connect with God.
Absolutely.
Because he created those desires within us.
Yep.
So to be able to celebrate that somebody has found the time and the space to be able to do something that they love is amazing. It reminds me of that, what is it, is it Chariots of Fire, the runner who said, when I run, I feel God's pleasure. And he was like in a missionary family. And
him and I are very different.
Yeah. Yes. I don't know that. Yeah.
I do not feel God's presence running.
I think it's Eric Liddell. I might be wrong. And his sister looked down on him for like running in these races and because you should be doing the Lord's work instead of running in these races. But he was really talented. And one of his famous quotes is, when I run, I feel God's pleasure. But it's more celebrated to do the things that we've created as God's work, that somebody has told us is God's work, than going out and finding those pleasures and those unique designs that God has created in us. It's celebrated a lot less.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you were going to say something about Jeremiah 17.
Yeah, I found this.
Or not 17.
I found another perspective. This is from David Sloan, and I thought this was really interesting. I want to use the notes because I don't want to misspeak it. Well, let me read the verse. So Jeremiah 17, 9 through 10. The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? I, the Lord, search the heart and examine the mind to reward each person according to their conduct, according to what their deeds deserve. So a lot of times he starts off by acknowledging that people say that you shouldn't follow your heart. Your heart's deceitful. But what he's pointing out is that he's saying that the heart is hard to understand, because he answers that right afterwards. Who can understand it? He answers that right afterwards, that the Lord can understand it. So Jeremiah was a misunderstood prophet. People thought that he wasn't trusting God. And so who is the one whose heart is turned from the Lord, and who is the one whose confidence is in the Lord? We may try to discern this ourselves, but the heart is deceitful above all things. So Jeremiah's point seems to be that someone could profess that they have put their trust in the Lord and even think they have put their trust in the Lord, when all of this is a mask for what is really going on in their heart. Likewise, someone could seem to have a fickle faith, but at their core is a trust that is in the Lord and not in men. So he's not saying that the heart is deceitful, it's going to lead you down a sinful path. He's saying that the heart is hard to understand, who can understand it?
Yep.
The Lord can understand it. So almost comforting himself too, that like as a prophet, that people looked at him as a prophet who didn't trust God. They didn't think that what he was saying was right, but he knows that God understands all that. So
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that what David Sloan did there is still keep it as kind of an individual thing, but I agree with that premise. I would just argue, and David Sloan and I are not arguing at the moment.
yeah.
But that it was more about the corporateness of all of Israel, not even the individualness of Jeremiah. But it's about are we trusting in God to take care of us and provide for us in this circumstance, or what? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's definitely been misused, and abused. And what's interesting to me is my experience of people asking me about that passage. I don't think I ever had a male ask me about that passage.
Wow.
I do. And that just came to me when you first asked about it, is that when I think back as a pastor over the years of who has brought that question to me, off the top of my head, I can only think of women that have done that.
And I have some thoughts on that.
I thought you might.
Because I've actually been sitting here like just thinking about this. I believe that verse in particular, but then also some other verses and just sort of tradition and whatever, has been weaponized against women when we feel that something is inherently wrong with relationships. But we're told that, well, the man is the head of the household, and we're told complementarian beliefs like this is a woman's role, this is a man's role, and even the more toxic kinds of things that came from like what's the name, Mark Driscoll, who was very much like women are basically sex slaves to their husbands. Like, it was like all this kind of stuff. And when we as women are like, this doesn't feel right, this sort of authoritarian male over the woman in a relationship, a woman should just do whatever her husband wants and she's just there to serve him and everything. And we go, this doesn't feel right. They go, you can't trust your emotions. Mm-hmm. The heart is deceitful. This is God's plan for you. God's plan is for you to be your husband's helpmeet.
Yeah.
And I definitely think that's why you have women that come to you with that question.
It's even a misappropriation of helpmeet.
That as well.
Which, is a term used for God.
Right.
God is our comfort.
Thank you for
God
saying
is our
godly.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that's why so many women have come to you and been like, what about this verse? Because it's been weaponized.
Well, what's for me, I would say, I never question why are they coming to me and asking me about this question. It just never dawned on me that it's been predominantly or exclusively women. It's never been a verse I personally have struggled with. Ever. Like I've heard it a ton of times, but it's just not a verse that I've even given more than a couple minutes of thought to, outside of counseling someone who has used it, it has been used towards them as harm.
Well, I've had other women,
Well, our very first live stream that we did a couple months ago, where it was open Q&A, and we did a thing on tough passages. That was the first verse that was brought. And so, yeah, it's a shame.
Yeah. So there's so many more things we can talk about, and I think we're definitely going to have a part 2. So where do we want to wrap this discussion up today?
Yeah. Well, I think this beginning intro is just kind of to open the door to looking at emotions in a different way, considering that an emotion in itself isn't sinful. And it doesn't mean, and I also want to say too that there are a lot of things that affect our emotions. So I think maybe historically some of the difference between men and women have to do that women biologically are on a monthly cycle of hormones, where men are, if I understand it correctly, stable in terms of their hormones throughout their lives. And
I'm definitely stable.
I mean,
I'm as
yeah.
stable as it gets.
Are you a very stable
If everything's
genius?
like functioning normally, right?
Yeah.
I'm terrible at like the science. I always like learn these things and then save like the bare minimum of like, or I just go straight to how does this affect me and then save that and then I can't explain it. But
I feel like that's very relatable.
I feel seen, Sarah. Thank you.
But I want to say that too, because, you know, as women, that we do have these hormonal changes that can influence our emotions. So the fact that this idea of emotions not being trustworthy, I think there could be some connection to that. Because I remember dating a guy in college and like every day, I finally caught on to this like pattern that like the day before my cycle was going to start, I always wanted to break up with him. But in my head, I had all these like very real, like good reasons to like end the relationship. But then the next day when my hormones shifted, it was like, oh, all is right in the world. And then it was when I noticed how stark one day was to the next that I'm like, oh, because I always knew hormones existed, but I kind of just discounted them. And I'm like, oh, I'm logical. Like, but like there are physiological, maybe is the right word, things going on that we have to be aware of. Or even in my old age, as I like go to doctors and try to like balance my hormones, and I've noticed overall changes in my emotions and how I handle them. So I think that's part of the puzzle too, that we can't take that scientific fact and say all emotions are untrustworthy, but we need to take the whole picture into account. So especially as women, if we're thinking about what we're feeling, journaling about it, which I highly recommend, that we can remember the biological as we're assessing what we're feeling and what weight we need to put on with what we're feeling and where we need to move forward and what action we need to take based on what we're feeling. And to the journaling piece, one of the recommendations from Pastor Pete, the author of Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, one of the tools is, he calls it exploring the iceberg, like this idea that an iceberg, you only see a small part of the iceberg, but underneath the surface is this huge, think Titanic problem.
Literally.
Yeah. So all that stuff that's underneath the surface. So what this exercise is basically, it's kind of like another quadrant. You can put an emotion like in each box, like anger, happiness, frustration, fear, and then you just kind of journal out what you're feeling, what is making you feel those feelings currently. And then you do this over time, and then you look back, and it's partly, one of the things that emotionally healthy spirituality points to is to identify those things that actually do bring you happiness or joy, and reflecting on your life of how you can bring and put your energies towards those things, so that if you're going through life and doing something that's constantly causing difficulty or sadness, that can be a clue of how, and this is kind of, I think, like a Ignatian idea, like kind of the daily examine, like what's bringing you closer to God, what is bringing you farther to God. So as you identify those things that bring you pleasure, giving permission to build your life around those things as much as you're able. Yeah, we all have to do the dishes. We all have things that are less than desirable, but it's just a tool to, number one, process those emotions, get them out on paper, and then start to see patterns. Because when you write it out, you're actually seeing it. You're not just stuffing it down and pretending it's not there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it is necessary to recognize the physiological causes of emotions, which probably extends to men as well, because I imagine the excess of testosterone builds up to anger. But I do want to just reiterate that people weaponize so much the monthly cycle
Right.
against women, and that I just want to reemphasize like that doesn't mean that none of those emotions are valid.
Right.
They might be amplified.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not married to the guy you were dating in
Yeah.
college, right?
Right. Yeah.
But they might be amplified, but it doesn't mean they're just like, we can just dismiss them.
Yes, exactly. I just wanted to bring that as part of the argument because I think we want to look at the whole picture. We don't want
Sure.
to
Yeah.
because it's been weaponized, we don't want to just not talk about it,
Right,
Like,
yeah.
like let's address it and let's talk about
Yeah.
it and like
Yes, we get
Yeah,
more emotional
so-
around our periods, but it doesn't mean
Yeah.
that anything we say is invalidated for those 5 days or whatever.
Well, if I can give perspective.
Oh, please.
Actually, I'm not. So one of the things that I learned way too late in life, and also just in Tana and I's marriage and relationship, was that when I perceived Tana to be, overreacting, or I perceived, oh, this is your monthly cycle, right? Like you're menstruating. Here we go, right? What I realized that's so simple, basic, and just needs to be taught is that regardless of whether or not I think in this moment there is a heightened response that is too much or not enough, or what the response doesn't fit my manicured expectation, emphasis on man, that you're still feeling
Yes.
that.
Right.
yes.
Regardless of whether or not I think it's reasonable, is insignificant. You are still feeling that emotion. And my job as a person who loves you and cares about you is to say, what can I do in this moment to care for you and where that emotion's coming from?
And listeners, watchers, he does.
Because but that was a switch for me that started in my household way too late, but I would argue has impacted every other aspect of my life, because I often try to remind myself, take a breath. If I feel like the emotion or the reaction coming at me is greater than what it maybe needs to be, I need to still take a breath instead of responding to it as if you're overreacting. I need to say, this person really feels this angry right now.
Yeah.
And me saying you're overreacting, I don't know about you guys, but my experience with that has not been that it reduces the anger that the other person.
I am? Oh, I'll stop.
So,
yeah. It's like the idea of don't make a mountain out of a molehill.
right.
But
But it is a mountain right now.
yeah, but it's not a molehill to you.
That's
I mean,
correct.
Right.
And for us on the receiving end of someone else's emotions, we need to be willing to say, okay, maybe this is a mountain molehill moment, but they're really feeling the mountain.
Yeah.
And what can I do to help them either move to a space where they can see it's a molehill? And again, this isn't about solving or fixing people's emotions. This is a really delicate to talk about.
Yeah,
Yes,
it really
yeah.
is.
But it's acknowledging that. I think at the end of the day, that's where I want to leave it.
Yeah.
You need to acknowledge that the person is really feeling that emotion,
Yeah.
regardless of whether it's accurate to the situation or not.
Right.
It's irrelevant.
Right.
They're really feeling that. And it's our responsibility as people of care, people of compassion, people of mercy, people of faith, to let a person feel those emotions. As you were saying earlier about letting a child cry, we need to let our fellow sojourners in life feel their emotion, give them a safe space to express it. And then after they have a good cry, they have a good moment of feeling that emotion, then maybe we can resolve some of the things that has created it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of the comparison we've talked about before, the priest versus prophet.
Yes.
Like instead of being the prophet in that moment or the teacher or trying to solve the problem, being the priest and being there to comfort and intercede with God and be that, and then
yes.
later.
Yeah, but we tend to go straight to prophet.
Yeah.
Well, that's our time. There's clearly a lot more we have to talk about around the subject of emotions. So we'll just dangle that out there as incentive to come back and listen next week. So thank you all for joining us today. If you want to learn more about the podcast or find links to our YouTube channel and other things, you can go to ajffpodcast.com. If you want to support us, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/ajff. And we'll see you next time. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.